No need to. So we decided to give you sort of a layered experience. First Godard, and then Harold Ramis. Yeah. What we're going to do is a little different. We're going to show clips of Harold's earliest years. But what I want to do even before we show you the clips is tell you why, because this is actually another first. In 17 years, we've never really done a tribute to a filmmaker. We've dedicated festivals to filmmakers who have passed on, and in our program booklet. But I noticed something. I was on an airplane, either coming to or going to or coming from LA when I heard that Harold Ramis had passed away, and it was so, I was just so sad by it, because he is one of the filmmakers that we had gotten to know. He is from Chicago. He moved to LA. He moved back to Chicago, and one thing that I noticed about him, even when people talk about him to us or to his wife, Erica, who's going to be on stage later, they will say something like, Eric, you know, Harold reminded me a little bit of Roger in a way, and they would say whatever that way is. And even in the program booklet, instead of using our words, I decided to use Erica's words. On the inside cover, she said, honestly, Harold was a Renaissance man who enjoyed so many things, just like Roger. He was not only sweet, but deeply intelligent and insightful and inquisitive. He had his feet on the ground the whole time, enjoying every minute of it. When I was traveling around the country around the time shortly after Harold died, I would read everything that people would say in tribute to him. And one of the things that I noticed is, through all the accolades and everything, I thought that sometimes, I thought all of these years of entertainment, and I would read something, and I would say people didn't know, well, some people really got it, how deeply and profoundly his images permeated our society. And I knew him to be not only a man of deep intelligence, I think actually he was a genius. He is a very deep thinker. And one of the things that I thought was really impressive at his funeral service, there was like this table, and he used to teach himself a lot of things. I think he taught himself to knit. He used to make things, and he made things by hand, and he wanted to have play the violin. But he couldn't just get a violin and take lessons. He wanted to sort of teach himself how to play the violin as well. And he wanted to build his own violin, but in order to build the violin, he had to build the table to make the violin. So he built a table, then he built the violin, and then sort of taught himself to play the violin. He really was truly a Renaissance man. And when you look at all of his work, he was in almost every aspect of entertainment: a writer, a producer, a director, an actor, and you'll see all of those. So what we decided to do tonight, before we introduce our special guest, we're going to show you a clip of the early years of his work, and then we'll bring our guest out, we'll talk about him, and then we'll show you clips of the later years. And then we're going to show you, at the end, a clip of Roger and Gene Siskel's review of Groundhog Day, and, and talk about why that film has become such a classic. So why don't we start with the clips of the early years. Okay, we're going to do it a little differently because we're going to bring out Mann Ramis, who is she's a writer, producer, and philanthropist. She was born in Santa Monica, moved to Chicago over 20 years ago with her late husband, Harold Ramis, and their 2 children, Julian and Daniel. And Julian is in the audience. Will you please stand, Julian? Most recently, Erica co-produced a documentary about the Joffrey Ballet called Joffrey, Mavericks of American Dance, and she's currently collaborating on a yet-to-be-titled project about her late husband. She is an advocate for education, social justice, and women's rights around the world. Will you please help me welcome Erica Ramis? I'm not going to say anything too personal, but I just want to say, from one widow to another, I know how difficult it is for you. We both had very brilliant men who both were very generous and also very funny and irreverent. And I just think that Harold did so much in the world of film, entertainment, like I say, but also as I rewatched over the last year, I rewatched some of his movies, and I saw all these little philosophies of life hidden, and that's one of the things I want you to help tell us about. But and we have Trevor Albert to do it, one moment, but we have to give a golden thumb to you. Nate? And will you take the middle seat, please? Yes. And we also are going to introduce Trevor Albert. He developed a great rapport with Harold when he was working on productions. And, he was also the gopher puppet for Ramis's directorial debut in Caddyshack in 1980. The two went on to make numerous comedies, including National Lampoon's Vacation in 1983, Club Paradise in 1986, and Groundhog Day in 1993. Albert has since produced a series of films, including The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, The First 20 Million is Always the Hardest, Because of Winn-Dixie, Waiting for Forever, and the 2014 Academy Award-nominated documentary, Glenn Campbell, I'll Be Me. Will you please help me welcome Trevor Albert? And please accept a golden thumb.
I do.
Great, great.
Thank you.
And will you join us here, and we'll introduce the other panelists. Glenn Kinney is the editor of A Galaxy Not So Far Away, Writers and Artists on 25 Years of Star Wars, and the author of Robert De Niro, Anatomy of an Actor. His writings on the arts have appeared in a wide variety of publications from the mid-1990s to the magazine's 2007 folding. He was a senior editor and the chief film critic for Premiere. There he commissioned and edited pieces by David Foster Wallace, Tony Kushner, Martin Amis, and other well-regarded writers. He currently contributes film reviews and essays to RogerEbert.com and other outlets. Will you please help me welcome Glenn Kinney? And we also have Susan Wloszczyna. She spent much of her nearly 30 years at USA Today as a senior entertainment reporter doing her dream job, visiting the New Zealand film set of The Lord of the Rings. Oh, wait a minute. You were a zombie extra in George Romero's Land of the Dead? Okay, all right. And interviewing countless showbiz figures, including Spike Lee. Her positions at the newspaper included being a film reviewer for 12 years, as well as the life section copy desk chief. And you are also the chief, the president of the Women's Film Journal. Oh, okay. All right. Well, you know, Roger always would make up stuff, so. I'm just following in his footsteps. Anyway, welcome, Susan. How many microphones do we have?
I think we have a total of 3.
We'll pass them around, but first I'd like to start with Trevor Albert, because I'd like to know how you, tell us a little bit about how you began working with Harold.
Well, strangely enough, I graduated from a film school, or university, but I studied film in California called UCSD, and the only reason that I ended up getting into film, I was studying journalism, and a friend of mine said, come to a class with me, we're watching films. I thought, oh, you can actually go to class and watch films, that sounds good. And so I went, and the teacher who was teaching the class was a guy named Jean-Pierre Gorin, who was Godard's co-director on a number of movies. So, and he blew my mind, and so it really inspired me to become a filmmaker. So it's just so odd that I would come here tonight and there would be a Godard movie. So all these years later, it was meant to be.
Did
anyway,
you know Manny Farber as well?
Yes, I did. Those two guys got me into film. So I graduated having studied movies very much like that Godard movie, thinking I was going to reinvent cinema, and I went to Los Angeles to reinvent cinema, and looking for a job. I ended up getting a job working for Barbra Streisand, which was not reinventing cinema. And I worked for her and her, at that time, boyfriend, a guy named John Peters, and they were given, or John Peters, her boyfriend, was given a script to produce called Caddyshack. And I was the office assistant sort of running around, and every time I saw Harold or Doug Kinney, the guys that were involved in writing Caddyshack, I just tried to ingratiate myself as much as I could, because I really did not want to spend my career taking Barbra Streisand's dog to the groomer. So I managed to get Harold's attention, and he asked John Peters if, when they went to make Caddyshack, if I would go as a production assistant. And so I was sent to Florida as a production assistant. In the first couple of weeks, Harold's assistant left, was fired for some odd reason, and Harold said, hey, you want to be my assistant? And so that began my relationship with Harold. And you know, I soaked up as much of his wisdom and sense of humor as I possibly could. But on that movie, as has been widely reported, it was more chaos than wisdom. There was an excessive amount of frivolity involving a drug that's now illegal in Colorado. Anyway, so that was my start in show business.
And Erica, I wanted to ask you a question just generally, and then I'm going to go to Glenn and Susan. And that is, if there's an overall summation, I hope this question isn't unfair, an overall summation of what you would say about your husband's movies, how would you categorize them?
The answer is funny. But I would, but I think his humor was always layered with intelligence and wisdom sprinkled in, as well as, you know, slipping on banana peels and finding candy bars in pools. I mean, so he was able to bring it all out.
You know, Roger and I loved Caddyshack, and we would watch that together sometimes we'd have guests on weekends. And the one thing we didn't understand until later is we always thought it was so odd that the Bill Murray character was talking about being the caddy to the Dalai Lama or the Dalai Lama. And I wanted to ask Trevor about that reference in the movie.
You mean if he really was caddy to the Dalai Lama? I don't believe he never did caddy for the Dalai Lama.
No, but why that was added to the script?
There was a fair amount, and I can't remember if that was in the original script or if that was one of the improv lines, but there was a lot of spontaneous creation going on, and that particular scene where he's putting the pitchfork in the young man's throat, telling him the story, was almost all improvised. And the young actor who was being talked to was terrified because that was a real pitchfork, and Bill was quite enthusiastic about the speech. But you know, it sort of speaks to what Erica was saying, which is there's you know, crude sort of juvenile humor, and then there's other stuff going on where you're talking. I mean, that Dalai Lama speech is absurdist, you know, and you know, almost existential, and yet, you know, in another minute there'll be a fart joke. So it was part of the thing where people, you know, I have to say, when I was 21 years old working on that movie, if anyone would ever have said all these years later that Roger and I love that movie, you know, two intelligent people, I would have thought they were out of their minds. So it just, you know, speaks to the, you know, unpredictability of movies and how things are going to last. And
in fact, Roger was actually was going to start a movement to get I don't get no respect.
Rodney Dangerfield.
Oh, Rodney Dangerfield inducted into the Academy of Arts and Sciences because, you know, we would see him sometimes and he would say, you know, I made so many movies, I don't get no respect. You know, the Academy, they look at some of these people they put on their committee, and I made them billions of dollars, and I just don't get no respect. And Roger said, Rodney Dangerfield really should be a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences so he can vote for Oscars as well. And I don't know if he ever even got an honorary one. But
the Academy doesn't have great regard for comedy. And that's sort of been a tradition which sort of continues today. And, you know, I don't understand it exactly, but Rodney he was never in the Academy, nor did he ever win an Academy Award. Nor has anyone really used those two words together, Rodney Dangerfield and Academy Award.
Well, but to vote on one, he didn't have to have won one.
But let me just say one thing about Rodney Dangerfield. And Rodney Dangerfield had never been in a movie before. He'd never acted before. And this was part of Harold's thing. In the midst of all the insanity, he was able to find a center. Erica said in his thing, he always had his feet on the ground. Nobody else had their feet on the ground on that movie. And Rodney Dangerfield was literally like a cartoon character on the set. I mean, he was so over the top. And yet Harold, in the midst of all this, could sort of, you know, put a hand on Rodney and say, all right, let's do it this way, let's do it that way. And, you know, out of the corner of his eye, he'd see Bill Murray pushing Chevy Chase in the lake. You know, it was like, but he managed to make everybody feel like they were important, that they were heard, and bring out the sort of best comedy in them. And part of it was encouraging the improvisation. So that was part of his, you know, conducting insanity.
And I want to ask later, I'm going to open it up to Glenn and Susan, but I also want to ask, Trevor, you got a chance to watch his evolution over the years from being an actor and being a writer and being a director, and I want to know a little bit of what you observed in him as he moved from these various roles.
On Caddyshack, the first day of shooting, we were all standing around, and the actors got in their places, and the sound person said rolling, and everyone looked to Harold to say action, and he had no idea he was supposed to say action. So he jokingly says it was $7 million film school, Caddyshack. He literally learned how to make a movie, and that's extraordinary because having been around the process of making movies, it's terrifying. You have 150 people waiting, and you have the studio. So the fact that Harold was confident enough that he could be put in that position and not really be intimidated by it, I mean, he was like game. He felt like he could handle it, he could master this thing. And so the evolution was, it took him no time at all to figure out the technical stuff, which wasn't that hard. And I think the evolution was just trying to find what he was interested in, what stories he was interested in telling and still making them entertaining. You know, Animal House was broad, but it was, you know, sort of about class. You know, there was and as was Caddyshack, as absurd as Caddyshack was, I think Harold and Doug and Brian would all say, yeah, it was about the struggle. We were poor kids, and we were, you know, in this environment where the rich kids were at the country club, and we were getting them, you know, their coffee. And so all even his early stuff, although you look at it and say, that's just, you know, good fun, there was something that he was trying to say, and I think that developed as the years went on. I don't think there's a movie that he was involved with that he wouldn't be able to talk about what it, you know, the deeper level. And so, yeah, and I think Groundhog Day might have been the culmination of that. You know, it just sort of all came together. But, you know, he just became more and more thoughtful about the work. And, you know, and he matured. And I don't think he could have made Caddyshack you know, after he'd been doing it for 15 years.
Glad you have some specific observations.
Well, you know, from a guy of my age, a late baby boomer, watching Harold Ramis as an actor in the late 70s, early 80s that was kind of like the guy you wanted to be, and even to the extent of when I had hair, it looked kind of like Ramis's in the ESL section of Stripes. But one of the clips that you don't have is Ramis sitting next to John Candy when Candy's going on about wanting to be a lean, mean fighting machine, and Harold's sitting there going like. And that if you were a sort of a guy of sardonic bent of that generation, that was what you aspired to do. That was what you aspired to be. You wanted to be that kind of wise ass. You wanted to be a wise ass, but also a mensch. So, you know, in that respect, his screen presence was unbelievable and really great and a lot of fun. But also as a creator and as a director, I think a lot of it goes back to his work on SCTV and working with those incredible improvising guys. And this was stuff that was really, really smart comedy, but it wasn't self-consciously smart comedy. It wasn't trying to be smart. It came out of who these people were and what their interests were and their weird little showbiz obsessions. And working with those guys and nurturing those guys and being part of that collective, I think really helped give him that vision that you're talking about that then went into his direction and is just a through line throughout all the films he directed. And the thing about something like Caddyshack, even in the tagline for the movie, it's the slobs versus the snobs. But I think what Harold Ramis was able to bring, aside from, you know, being the calm center of this chaos and understanding very precisely how each performer's strengths fit into what was going on. But someone like Doug Kenny's vision was a lot more visceral and angry. And, you know, Harold Ramis could be a little more detached. And so he could bring also a kind of a gentleness to it that made the films, you know, more popular than they might have been if they'd been a sort of undiluted version of the Doug Kenny vinegar. And I think that's also really, really interesting. And it's also this sort of compassion that's there that he carries through, but also always intelligence. I remember very well a really brilliant interview he did with The Believer, a literary magazine, and talking about moviegoers and saying, well, I just want to go somewhere and turn off my brain for 2 hours. And Harold's reaction was pretty visceral. It's like, I read that, I want to shoot myself. That's who wants to turn off your brain? Why would you ever even want to do that? And, you know, even in these moments of low comedy, you know, the famous closing line of Caddyshack, hey, we're all going to get laid, which was changed on the television version to, hey, we're all going to take a shower, which is really weird.
That's even worse.
It really was. When it was first shown on network television, Rodney Dangerfield says, hey, we're all going to take a shower. What? But even in those moments of really kind of lowbrow comedy, there's intelligence and compassion always.
Well, that is a good segue because I was trying to think of his films. I actually got educated on a few things from watching them. You wouldn't think you could pick up things, but for instance, if you remember from Animal House, I learned that vegetables are sensual and people are sensuous. So whenever I use those words, I think of Animal House and hopefully get the right one. The other thing I didn't know was that the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor. Did you know that? You should. Okay. And also in Stripes, I didn't get consumed by the hair so much. It was the spatula.
You didn't have to.
It was the spatula he used on PJ Souls and I didn't know that could be a tool of seduction. So I
Only
won't
with
go
PJ
on
Souls,
from there,
sorry.
but just say I found it useful. So okay. And from Meatballs, we all learned it just doesn't matter. So you can chant that if you want, but we won't now. And the one thing I always think of when I drive is don't drive angry, because really it got them in trouble. And I wasn't, you know, we don't come, you know, most of us wouldn't be reincarnated over and over again. So it's a good thing. So but the other thing is, when I was thinking about Harold, is he had this amazing thing. I mean, it says in that one clip, don't cross streams, but he actually crossed 3 comedy streams in himself, in that he worked with National Lampoon guys, he worked with SCTV guys, and he worked with Saturday Night Live guys, and that group basically formed this amazing, you know, company of characters and actors that, you know, and he was the person who basically brought those people together, and that's why we had this whole long run of you know, funny movies. And he also knew what to do with people like John Belushi and Bill Murray that I don't think other directors would have the sensibility to bring out the best in them, and also probably the patience to deal with them. So I think, you know, he even made Robert De Niro funny. And the thing with Rodney Dangerfield is after he was in Harold's movies, then he got to be in Natural Born Killers, which, you know, wouldn't be probably, yeah, why? But I'm sure if he didn't do those other films, he wouldn't have gotten dramatic roles like that. So.
I want to ask Trevor a question about how he worked with actors. What was his, and you as a producer on those films, what was his methodology, and how did he, because he came at it both from a writing standpoint and an acting standpoint, and so when he was directing, how did that inform how he worked with the actors in the movies?
But I think with every actor it was different. I think he never changed. You know, him not on a set, not working, was no different than when he was on a set working. His personality didn't change. So, you know, you talked about him being kind and thoughtful and intelligent. So when he would give notes to an actor, he didn't, he never yelled. Never heard him yell on a set. He was never superior. He just talked to the actor about a line or something in a gentle way, like was his, you know, personality. So, you know, he was. There were times when there were struggles with actors who, I mean, I guess I can talk about it now, all these years later. In Groundhog Day, there was debate about the nature of the tone of the movie. And that debate was between Harold and Mr. Murray. And Harold was always, even though he understood that there were deeper issues that were going to be explored in the movie, he wanted it to be a comedy. He wanted it to be funny. It had to be entertaining otherwise. If it got too existential, like the original script, maybe nobody would see it. And so I would say that may have been the only time I ever saw him not particularly successful in communicating with an actor, because Bill was pretty headstrong. Harold ended up getting his way, but the collateral damage was it hurt their friendship, I think. And like I say, Harold was a friend to actors. Just it wasn't like off the set he was a different person and he wouldn't hang out with them. So, but with other actors,
can you tell us what is it that he wanted to do more in the movie, or what maybe did Bill Murray want to see?
Well, Bill Murray didn't want the day to repeat. No, I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. Just kidding. Do not tell Bill I said that. So, he's not from Illinois, is he?
You know what?
Yikes.
Are we streaming this? I never know whether we're streaming or not. Anyway.
It's
yeah,
possible.
sometimes, you know what? I'm serious. Sometimes I like having, and we're going to have to do this, certain guests and certain things that we're going to talk about sometimes we're not going to stream, because I'd like to be able to tell you some things.
Wait, we're streaming
that we're not
this?
telling the whole world.
We're streaming this? Oh, back up the tape.
Anyway.
The answer to your question is the script that eventually was, so Danny Rubin wrote this wonderful script, great idea, and as is the way with movies, it's a collaborative process, and there's development and trying to make jokes funnier, make sure the romance works, and I think the romance was a very important part of the transition from the original script, and just finding more opportunities for laughs, and still keeping the time loop, which is was a very delicate thing in a script, and so we probably spent 9 months working on all those things, getting them to the point where we thought they were perfect, and to the point where if we changed a page, it would screw up the whole thing. So we were, I don't know, 10 weeks away from shooting, and Bill had some ideas about maybe how we could do some changes, and so that inherently is like, oh my God, we're so close. I thought you liked it, and so I can't even remember what the changes are. I just remember that he wanted to tweak something that we'd already felt like we'd gotten as good as we could get. And so it's not like he didn't want to destroy it. He just had ideas, and it felt like it was too late in the process to incorporate those big ideas into the script. And the other thing is you can improvise in Caddyshack and no problem. Improvising in Groundhog Day, much trickier.
Yes, especially in a comedy like that. Timing is everything, and you can't just go tweaking.
Yeah, and every day had to be the same, and you had to say the same stuff, and if you start improvising in that stuff, the whole thing comes apart.
And as you know, there was already a non-funny Groundhog Day. It was called Last Year at Marienbad.
Ah, yeah. That wasn't funny?
It's also arguable.
Yeah. What would I say? Eric was there on Groundhog Day. What point?
Somebody asked me a question.
How was it working
With Trevor?
with me? Yeah, with Harold. Well, you can talk about Groundhog Day. I mean, it's an interesting one to talk about because you were there during the struggles. These things. Okay.
All right. So
an idea.
One thing I will say is that Harold was one of the most diplomatic people I'd ever met. Trevor is right up there with him. Oh God. Excuse me. So anyway, but Harold had a way of listening to people both creatively and personally, but on the set he would listen to everyone, and he would listen to Bill and come back and think about things, talk to Trevor, and he had a way of finding a seed of what Bill was saying and kind of embracing that so that Bill could meet him with what he was trying to get out of the scene. And another example having nothing to do with Groundhog Day is often during the script writing process and going into the studio and meeting with executives and junior executives, and Trevor was in on many of those meetings. Harold told me every time he would go to a meeting, he would envision how he wanted it to go. And not that it always went exactly that way, but I think it worked for his positive energy and his motivation for it. But there were times when he would come back, and at one time he had a stack of papers with all the notes and the executives' names, and Harold, during the meeting, had crossed out many of the names and just made his own notes. But he always said to me, if out of 10, from 10 executives giving notes on something, if he had one idea that was given to him that opened up a thought or an idea for a joke, it was worth sitting through some torturous moments. And he was able to do that, so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What I'd like to do now is we have to go off stage again so they can take away the chairs, because we have a second set of clips we want to show you, and then we'll talk about specifically some of the later movies where Harold was directed. So if you give us just a moment, we'll be back. I wanted to ask Susan and Glenn, what influence do you think Harold's comedies had on the landscape of comedies in America?
A lot. Because I remember seeing Animal House in the theater on opening weekend, and back then movies weren't as hyped and you didn't know everything about it. There was no internet, no, the trailers you just saw on TV or in a movie theater. And sitting there with a crowd, seeing all that for the first time and not knowing anything. I mean, John Belushi, as good as he was the least of it. I never heard laughter like that. And I think a whole generation of filmmakers who saw that film and his other films went on to make the comedies that are successful now, like the Judd Apatow crew, the Farrelly brothers, the guys who made American Pie. I mean, comedy wasn't like that before Animal House. And the other thing is, sometimes filmmakers now don't get, is that yes, you can do improv and have anarchy on screen, but somehow Harold also had a structure, sense of structure and everything, that he was still telling a story. It was a beginning, middle, and end, and I get a feeling sometimes with comedies nowadays, they let the improv rule too much, and it feels like a lot of times it doesn't end up being a really good, sound story. So yes, they learned from him, but I think he still had his own special quality that you can't really imitate. It was him.
Yeah, no, when I was in, when we saw Animal House, a bunch of my high school friends immediately had a toga party, which, we vowed to never speak of again the morning after. And even just now, backstage, I had a bag that I had to leave there, and I said to the stagehands, "Don't touch my stuff. I don't want anyone touching my stuff." It's true, as you say, that, and of course, Harold played Seth Rogen's dad in Knocked Up. So you have that continuum, you have that connection, and Apatow, guys like Apatow have been very upfront about the influence that they got. What we don't always have, well, sometimes we do have, but not always, is this sense of no matter who's directing, writing, acting, because the clips we've been seeing have shown all the different facets of Harold Ramis's contributions to comedy, everybody is looking out to bring the best out in each other. There's a very interesting thing in the clip that was shown at the beginning of the evening from Stripes where Harold's character in Stripes is giving that funny talk about don't ever hit another guy unless you're pretty sure you can beat him. That's a pretty funny line, you know, and if Ivan Reitman had just stayed on that shot, that still would have gotten a pretty good laugh, but he doesn't stay on the shot. He cuts away to Warren Oates, and Warren Oates, who's a genius actor, not necessarily known as a comic actor, and he underplays this little reaction of sort of like thinking, you know, he's a very nuanced actor. He's thinking, is this guy shitting me? Is this, you know? And that really brings the laugh. It makes the laugh about 2 or 3 times harder than it would have been. And you see that kind of work in all the films, I think, that Harold was involved in, where everybody is kind of like, it's not this sloppy thing where they're letting the camera roll and the improv is happening and maybe it's hit and miss. It's very worked out, even under circumstances that are weird and people are kind of slushy and stuff. When they're in the editing room, when they're going through the continuum, they do the thing that gets the biggest laugh every time, and that's the what's the secret of comedy? Timing. Yeah. Did Harold ever share any of his secrets about that with you over the course of your relationship?
Did he share any of his secrets? I wish I knew how to answer that question. I think that's how he lived. You know, I mean, he really was attentive and funny and involved and inquisitive and all the time, you know, and I'm funny too. and I added to that. But I'm not sure how else to answer that, you know. I think his secret was really being down to earth and authentic. I do.
One of the movies, the reason we wanted to show Roger's review of Groundhog Day is because Groundhog Day has become this classic. It has even been adopted by some Buddhist organizations as an example of living life over and over again until you get it right. And when it first came out, you know, Roger talked in later years. He reviewed the movie, and I think he reviewed it again later and added it to the great movie series, because he said that even though he thought it was very, you know, intelligently done and very entertaining, he said that over the years it grew on him even more, and he realized that because it was so well done, maybe it had been underrated a little bit in the beginning.
It's like with the movie, the more you see it, the more you get out of it. And I find it one of those movies I can watch and see something I didn't notice or I forgot over and over again, and you get more out of it. And that's rare for just a comedy. This is more than that.
And I'd like to ask Trevor a little bit about the sort of the Zen Buddhist aspects of Groundhog Day.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about when it came out, it was not treated as an elevated piece of comedy. I mean, I think people liked it. It wasn't hugely successful. You know, it made money and it got pretty good reviews. But again, it was one of these things that time was kind to. We never had a in-depth conversation about pushing any spiritual agenda in the script. I want to say the first weekend it opened, I have this vague memory of a bunch of Hasidic Jews outside one of the screenings. Somebody said, you got to go and check it out. I think it's somewhere in Los Angeles. There were Hasidic Jews, and I thought they were picketing, but they had signs up saying it was the Chabadniks. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them, sort of a rather strict discipline of Judaism, and they were... The sign said, do you feel like you're living the same day over and over again? And it was a way to bring people into their, temple to, tell them what they're doing so that they won't have to. So that was the first time I thought, what? Really? Our little comedy? They're And then we started getting letters from Buddhist followers of Buddhism saying, thank you so much for making a movie about Buddhism. And so we had the Jews, and then we had Christians, and then we had a psychoanalysis community saying, yes, this is right, what we're trying to tell people, you know. They're stuck in their patterns, and we're really, you know, trying to make them understand that you have to break those patterns, and thanks for making that movie. So it's a beautiful thing. I mean, as filmmakers, we couldn't have been more delighted, but it was not, this was not our grand scheme. You know, some people have sent me articles, websites about the deeper meaning of Groundhog Day. Hopefully people are making a living doing this. So it's fascinating, and it's heartening, but it was not necessarily our intention to embrace any religion.
And I'm actually glad that you brought that up, because even though I said Buddhist, when you go on the internet and you read the deeper meaning of Groundhog Day, there are followers of, you know, not just Buddhist, Christianity, Judaism, all kinds of religious and spiritual followers really embrace Groundhog Day. And I think, like Susan said, the more you watch it, the more you get out of it. The first time it's just kind of funny and you know, a little entertaining, and then you go deeper into the surface. But I found that about a lot of Harold's movies, that when I really go back, one of the things that Roger and I talked about is there is a sweetness. You know, some of them can be irreverent and on the face of it, you know, a little bit of a juvenile humor, but they're so intelligent. And like when Susan talked about parsing the difference between sensuous and sensual, you find that a lot, his meticulousness in the written word in his movies. I just think he did so much in the entertainment landscape, but at the same time in the humanity aspects of his film, which is really important to me. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to what Erica was saying and what I was saying about he was all the things that are in his movies are what he was. He was a very funny guy. His movies are very funny. He was very humanistic. He was a kind guy. And even the darkest characters in his movies have the, you know, a redeeming quality, like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day or whatever. And so his personality was reflected. He was attracted to those, you know, kind of movies, you know. And so I think, I don't know that, having not studied, you know, comedy directors extensively, I don't know if this is a thing unique to Harold, but his, like I say, his personal ethos is reflected in his movies. And there was never a time, if there was a conversation about a scene and there was something that was mean-spirited or misogynistic or whatever, we would have serious conversations about it, and they would be gone. You know, it was so it wasn't a moral thing. It was just an instinct thing. It's like, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't do that. And so, you know, and I think that's sort of what you're alluding to, which is this sort of humanism. And you know, I think if he taught me anything, it was, I mean, when people say, what kind of movies are you attracted to, or looking for humanistic comedies, you know. And I think you look at Harold's stuff, and they do have a real humanity to them.
A really underrated one is Stewart Saves His Family.
Oh, I was hoping you'd mention that. What? Somebody's clapping?
You know, which seems to come out of a place of initially looks like it's coming out of a place of mild ridicule, but it becomes the thread it is a very compassionate and moving thing that happens in that movie.
Yeah, nobody saw it except for these 6 people here. Thank you very much.
Good for you guys.
I got the weirdest call. I got a call last week from a message saying, this is so-and-so from Vanity Fair magazine, and I'm calling because I'm doing an article on Stewart Saves His Family, and I'm thinking it's a friend of mine that's just screwing around with me. There's no way anyone's going to be doing an article, and sure enough, they're doing an article about that movie.
Those Vanity Fair kids, they're ahead of the curve.
Yeah, they're way ahead.
They go with a lot of the movie coverage you see online now is a lot of exploration of stuff that didn't get its due. It's one of the only good things you can say about online film writing, is that it tends to delve into those areas that where things were underrated.
So is it true that Harold called himself Buddhist? I guess Jewish and Buddhist. He did. No, I just read that. It made me laugh. So he still makes me laugh.
I wanted to ask you, do you know which one of his movies he was the most fond of?
I didn't live with him.
Which one was he the most fond of? I honestly don't know. I think he loved every movie he made. He was completely present on every set with all the work that he did in writing it. So I don't think he had a favorite. I think each one, he was learning something, giving something, and it was a unique experience in and of itself. I really do believe that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think same answer. And you know, my instinct is, oh, of course, Groundhog Day, that would be the one. But in fact, he was as proud of Stuart Saves His Family. And when Stuart Saves His Family came out, this was a small movie with Al Franken. I don't know if some people have seen it. It had a very short life, like about an hour. We had a test screening for the studio. I'll never forget this. The studio invites people to, you know, fill out cards and stuff. There were 500 people. The studio had never seen the movie before. We're all excited, and Al Franken's there, and I'm there, and Harold's there. And after the movie had run for about 10 minutes, I see a couple get up and go to the bathroom. Thinking, that's weird, a couple going themselves. And then another couple got up, and another couple got up. And by the time the screening was over, there were about 50 people in the theater. And I was just, I mean, it killed me. And it killed Al. And Harold was like, it's okay, you know, not for them, I guess. And the movie came out to not better reaction, and he still embraced the movie, believed in it, didn't turn on it because the audience didn't like it. And you know, that's, again, this sort of spirit that you know, very, very rare to see that in Hollywood, but he had it.
One thing, you probably know this, but Groundhog Day is going to be a Broadway show, which is amazing, so it continues. And then I didn't know this movie was coming out, but there's a new vacation movie coming out this summer. Nothing to...
Do you have anything to do with the Broadway show of Groundhog Day?
Well, this is a good cautionary Hollywood tale for any young people who are thinking of getting into the business. Neither Harold or I were called about the Broadway play. We heard about it like you did, basically. So don't go to it. No, I'm kidding. I hope it's good, but you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a question that people asked. Over the last year, when I would go around the country, this is Erica, when I went around the country promoting the movie Life Itself, the documentary about Roger, they would always ask what, either from his point of view or my point of view, so I'm asking from Harold's point of view or your point of view, what lasting thing do you think he would want people to take away from his life and his movies? And I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, Erica.
No, you're not. You ask big questions. You do. What lasting thing? Oh my God. You know, I sound like
one thing.
I may be repeating myself, but I really think several times we did hear the Dalai Lama speak, and in his simple, wise way, he says, you know, life is about being able to be happy and to learn how to experience that kind of joy and find it even in the most torturous of moments in whatever way you can. And I think, honestly, Harold had a bit of that ability in work, in family life, in friendship. He was curious, he loved words, he loved evolution, he loved the evolution of ideas and spirit. And he used to say that his body was just hanging around to hold his brain. and I think he really meant that. So I think, you know, it's kind of surreal sitting here and doing this, and I feel Harold strongly, and what comes to me, and I said this to Trevor earlier, it all just feels like a blink. Like I remember the moment I met Trevor and I met Harold, and suddenly here we are in this wonderful evening and showing Harold's films and trying to capture the essence of his creativity and his spirit. And how remarkable that he could make people laugh, that he could give that gift, and that you could, like Trevor said, even with Groundhog Day, that you could come back years later and see what has grown from something that was intended, and also it was the seed. You couldn't know that till years later. So I'm not sure how to end that, but I think in a certain way that's how Harold also lives on, and I'm grateful for it.
Thank you for all the joy he brought to us.